A coalition of civil rights groups have echoed the former INEC chairman, Atahiru Jega, who called for the amendment of the Electoral Act so that the power to appoint the chairman of Nigeria's independent national electoral body is divested from the president to free the commission from partisanship. The statement came at an electoral reform roundtable in Abuja. Arise correspondent Georgina Ndukwe-Ezeinka has the details.
9 months after the 2023 general elections, stakeholders have gathered to re-evaluate the conduct of the elections and areas of concern for Nigerians. This electoral reform roundtable by IGA Africa, with the theme Unpacking Nigeria's 2023 general elections and prospects for electoral reforms, is aimed at strengthening the country's electoral system.
The best time to tackle election reform is now, just after a major election, early on in the election cycle. And that's why the Kofi Annan Foundation encourages all of Nigeria's electoral stakeholders to take this opportunity to reflect on the 2023 experience and come up with recommendations on how best to strengthen its electoral institutions and processes going forward.
And so stakeholders and the Nigerian state needs to pay close attention on how to rebuild public confidence. And rebuilding public confidence begins with providing critical answers to some of the questions that citizens have asked.
Another issue raised here is the need to remove the powers of appointing INEC chairman and commissioners from the purview of the presidency, which is in line with the recommendation of the Justice Uwe's report. This same view was recently raised by former INEC chairman, Professor Atahiru Jega.
You can't have an electoral commission that is composed, of persons who are appointed by the president, and in some cases you have the incumbent as part of, a political party or leading a political party.
So the organizational structure we have today for elections is not efficient enough. If you look at the size of this country, you look at the pressure that they come under, because the stakes are very high. People are ready to do anything to win.
We can't talk about having a credible elections even from the state without us even canvassing for local government autonomy.
There are also attitudinal reforms that have to do with the culture of people, that have to do with building trust, that have to do with assuming responsibilities for actions as Nigerians, in order to ensure that this system, is sustained.
The major concern for stakeholders here includes the need to review the legal framework supporting Nigeria's electoral process, the need for strong institutions, and addressing the ambiguity in results collation process.
Both the law and the guidelines issued by INEC have some inconsistencies, and there is need to strengthen the law to make it compulsory for electronic transmission of results, because we believe that it would deepen the integrity of the process.
So we're going to review INEC guidelines. We're going to review all these issues that Nigerians have problems with. During amendment, we'll now make them to be a law.
There is urgent need for the electoral body to be restructured, as well as the digitization of the entire electoral process. Georgina Ndukwe-Ezeinka, Arise News.
So joining us now is Samson Itodu, Executive Director, Yaga Africa. Great to have you, Samson. Samson, but you see, like I asked Professor Jega yesterday, I said we are just, morning, great to have you again. I said we are just milling around. This was the exact same thing written in the Uwe's report that Professor Jega was part of around 2008 after the famous Yaradua elections. And we all agreed. But this is 2023, 2008 to this time. It's about 15 years after. And we are still talking about something we wrote and we all agreed to in a document 15 years ago. Which way Nigeria, my brother?
Well, thanks, Rufai, for having me, and good morning to everyone. Well, Rufai, the same way you feel perhaps frustrated or angry is the same. We feel the same way as well, that 15 years down the line, the discussion about unbundling INEC, the discussion about strengthening the independence of the Electoral Commission, is still on the table. And it just tells us one thing, that all through the last 15 years, there was lack of commitment on the part of the political class, especially those with the statutory responsibility, to restructure our electoral process and give INEC the independence that it deserves, that there's no commitment on their part. That you have majority members of the political class who care about just securing political power. They have no regard for democratic principles and values. And I just wish that this clamor and craze for political power is to use it to advance the common good. But as we have seen, they're looking for ways to hold institutions hostage so they can perpetuate themselves in office, to use political power to either settle inter-elite wars, primitive accumulation of wealth, and then oppress the people. And it's not necessarily the overall interest of the people. And that's one big lesson that we learn, over the last 15 years, especially as it relates to liberating the Electoral Commission, from the whims and caprices and interference of the executive.
Thank you very much, Samson, and again, good to see you. Well, YAGA Africa's experience sending a delegation to observe the Liberian elections. Following that, you had said a few things or some lessons that Nigeria can borrow from the process in Liberia. Perhaps that would also inform your conversation at the roundtable conversation you had, with the United Nations and Kofi Annan Center. With regards to what are some key lessons? You talked about the fact that the security personnel were not partisan. You talked about the way that faces of candidates were also put up at the polling center, and a few other things. I know that ideally, Liberia should be learning lessons from Nigeria in terms of how elections are run, but we can learn from any source in terms of how, what the good was when you were in Liberia. Can you share with us a few of your lessons?
Well, thanks, Ayo. I totally agree with you that Nigeria needs to learn lessons, and we have to learn lessons from other countries, especially when you have a class of your or a segment of your society, especially the political class, who don't play by the rules. In Liberia, we saw politicians, dedicated to complying with provisions of the law. There's an issue about the political culture in a particular context and how it shapes electoral politics and electoral competition. And I think that one lesson our politicians in Nigeria need to learn is patriotism and love for country. And I've said this repeatedly. You have a section of your political class that hate this country so much. They don't love this country because if they do, the kind of electoral malfeasance, the desperation for power, to the extent of suppressing voters or maiming and killing people or attacking political democratic institutions wouldn't be the case in our own climate. And so we need politicians that are statesmen and stateswomen. We need politicians that are patriotic. We need politicians that respect the will of the people. So that's one lesson. The second lesson is about the transparency of the results collation and transmission process in Liberia. And if there's one big lesson from Liberia, it's the fact that the whole value of transparency in not just driving citizens' participation, but it also enhances the acceptability of electoral outcomes. Just yesterday, the National Election Commission of Liberia issued the final statement and declared presidential runoff. But before, the Electoral Commission issued that statement yesterday, which for me to a large extent is fulfilling provisions of the law. As at last week or even 2 weeks, as at last week or 10 days ago, the entire country knew that we were already heading for a runoff. Why? Because the results tallying process was open, it was transparent, and there was compliance with the guidelines and the legal framework for managing the tallying process. In the tallying centers, unlike Nigeria, everybody who was present had access to the result sheets. Those results are uploaded in the next website, and you could access it. And that's one lesson we need to learn compared to what happened within our own climb in 2023. And if there's one bigger lesson, is the fact that the current results collation and transmission process for Nigeria needs to be retooled, it needs to be reformed, because citizens don't have faith in the current system that we practice. The third one is about the rights of the voter. The rights of the voter. In Nigeria, even our judicial institutions value institutional independence over and above the rights of the voter. This is why the courts in several occasions and in several cases have always ruled against the rights of the voter. And I give a case in point. Before the elections, citizens who, for no fault of theirs, who couldn't access their permanent voter's card, went to the court to enforce their rights to vote. In fact, in some cases, citizens had filed a case in court asking the court to rule that if INEC is unable to provide their PVCs and their names are on the beavers, can't they use the slip, to go vote at elections? But we know the fate of those citizens. Some of them couldn't cast their vote. But you see a country like Liberia where journalists who are on election duty, the electoral officials, security agencies are allowed to cast their vote on the day of election. Especially for presidential election, they can vote anywhere because the entire country is seen as one constituency. But in our own climb, we don't allow these people to vote. And so people have to sacrifice their right to vote just because they are offering national service. And that's something we need to, reform. Early voting within our own system, or we devise a means where these people who total up to 3 to 4 million, Nigerians should be able to cast their vote. The other lesson was around the structure and the format of the ballot paper. In Kenya, in Zambia, in most African countries where we have observed elections, the ballot papers have the images of the candidates and the logos of the political party. And Liberia took it a notch higher. For the presidential elections, they also introduced the image of the vice presidential candidate. Because what that does is enhances the quality of electoral choices and preferences that people made, because the state recognizes that it has a responsibility to give citizens the option to exercise choice. Because what is democracy without the free will to exercise choice and preference, not just at elections, but around the entire gamut of the electoral process? So these are some of the lessons that we can learn, we can adopt. They are very compatible with our context. But at the end of the day, beyond the political will, citizens also need to speak and demand their rights from the state. And the state does not have a choice, because first, it exists to advance the interest of citizens and not their interest, which is not the case as of today.
All right, Samson, good to see you again, and well done. Keep up the good work that your guys
Always a
doing.
pleasure.
Yes. So I'm looking at the information that is at our table here and the conversation regarding reviewing Nigeria's electoral process. I know the amount of work that YERGA puts into driving this agenda. I know to a large extent what organizations like Fix Politics is also putting into this work. So help us understand, from your years of being engaged actively with this particular project of electoral reform and making sure that our democracy grows better. Help us understand, where really is the problem with our National Assembly? Because some people allege that they're looking after their own survival, and it pays them to continue to have the chaos and the problems we have rather than have a very good electoral process. What do you think is really the problem that makes it impossible for the National Assembly to put the bill together and turn it into an act through the endorsement of the federal government and make it possible for some of these things to become really transparent?
So I think the last 2 to 3 decades of this entire process, there are 3 major lessons to learn. The first one is a conceptual problem. So we conceive electoral reform as just amendments to the legal framework. And so we've spent a lot of time and resources changing the laws and amending the laws. Yes, it's part of the process, but electoral reform needs to be situated within the broader context of democratic reforms. Because elections happen within a broader context. They don't happen in isolation of society. And what do I mean? That governance reform needs to be part of this conversation. I give a classic example. Elections are held in polling units. Polling units are situated or located in public places. And one of those public places are schools, our primary schools and our secondary schools. If you don't have good infrastructure, education infrastructure, you make it difficult for INEC to locate polling units in those public institutions. And if you followed elections across the years, you would see that when you go to results collation centers at the wards, there is no electricity. In some cases, there are no chairs or even tables for the INEC officials, to locate their polling, to set up the polling units. In some places, those polling units are even inaccessible because of the failure of governance. And so when we think about electoral reform, we need to note that elections are not enough, that democracy does not equate elections, that democracy is more than elections. It's about accountability, that when people hold power in trust for people, they have a responsibility to deliver to the people. And when they fail to do so, and citizens ask them questions, they should not mistake dissent or questions for opposition politics or lack of patriotism, because dissent is patriotism. Asking questions is a fundamental, critical feature of democracy. So we need to broaden our conceptualization of electoral reform. And adjoining to that is the whole notion of attitudinal change. So you can have the best of the laws, but if politicians don't change their attitude, honestly, we would engage in these cyclical reforms that would deliver nothing but ephemeral outcomes. And this is where our political class needs to change their attitude towards politics. And the first, attitude that needs to change is this approach and paradigm towards political power. That why are people seeking for public office? Why do people kill just because they want to secure political power? Why do people break the law because they want to secure party nomination? Why do people procure delegates, spend billions of naira because they want to buy delegates? Tell me, if people buy their way into public office, how do we expect them to lead and govern rightly and also advance public interest? Because when your political process is commercialized, when it is saturated with highest bidders and highest spenders, expect the less of governance. And so attitude needs to be changed on the part of our political class. They need to see public office as service to the people and not an opportunity to primitively accumulate wealth or an opportunity, to oppress the people, because political power needs to advance the common good. The third point about the legislation, we have implemented the 2022 Electoral Act, and we have clearly seen that there are ambiguities, there are complexities, and there are inadequacies in the Act. Some of these are accidental, some of them are also intentional, because we know how the entire reform process was politicized before the National Assembly passed the legislation and the former president assented to this. So I think that there are critical issues that we need to look at. The independence of the commission, some ambiguities that needs to be addressed, especially the loopholes within our electoral laws that were exploited, for the 2023 elections. Those issues are there. They are there in the public domain. It's not just Yaga Africa advocating for these issues, but the Nigerian people. You go on social media, you listen to them, they are advocating that you can't have the current setup within INEC and expect that it will deliver credible elections. You've got to review the appointment process. You need to professionalize the appointment process. You also need to ensure that you raise the threshold and the bar. The second is Nigerians are saying, listen, this results collation process, this transmission process has become confusing. We don't know because there are discordant tunes. Today we hear what IREF is, tomorrow they tell us is something else, next tomorrow is another thing. Can the law be clear? And one way to ensure it is clear is to limit the discretionary powers that institutions like INEC have and clearly state these things within the laws so that when there is an infraction, their lordships would not look for technicalities, substitute it for substantial justice or electoral justice. And these are some of the issues. And I think that the next couple of days and weeks, Nigerians need to raise, the ante on this discussion and get the National Assembly to serve public interest by reforming this process early in the day. But you can have the best of the laws. If you have a current political class that don't change their attitude, then we're not going to move the needle on reforms.
Raising the ante on this conversation is a very good place to wrap it up and talk about the fact that Nigerians are the citizens that should take their country and take it very seriously. Thank you very much, Samson Itodo, Executive Director for YAGA Africa.
Thank you, always a delight. Thank you.
Yes.